Good morning and welcome to Beginning the Word. Today we commence lesson number 4 in our series on the book of Galatians. Thank you for joining us for today's study. Turning our attention now to Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 and 12. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. We talked about this briefly on the tail end of yesterday's study, and we want to bring it up today to emphasize that God is the authority behind what Paul taught. And Paul is arguing very clearly that what he taught the saints at Galatia when he originally ministered there, when he came back later for visits, and when he writes this epistle to them, that this is all by the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is not what man had taught. This is a contrast with those false teachers that were troubling and deceiving the Galatians into following Moses' law and binding Moses' law and circumcision. So Paul is, with these words, insinuating not only his heavenly authority, but he's showing that his opponents, these false teachers, had only the word of man as their authority. This connects with Paul's apostolic claims in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 1, where he talked about being an apostle by the authority of Jesus Christ. Paul was inspired in what he taught. 1 Corinthians 2 and 10, he claimed that. 1 Corinthians 14 and 37, he said, the things that I write are the commands of the Lord. In 2 Peter 3 and 15, the apostle Peter commended Paul and his epistles and saying that he wrote according to the wisdom that was given to him. So there's this strong stamp of divine authority behind what Paul writes. In Ephesians 3, verse 3 and 4, there Paul said that he wrote by inspiration, by what the Lord inspired him to write, with the anticipation that others would read and understand his knowledge. So there's a clear chain of authority here in what Paul wrote. He had behind his teachings and his writing God. And when God inspired Paul, Paul would teach in his preaching work, and he would write letters to the churches. And when we would come, we meaning first century Christians or Christians today, and when we would come and read what Paul wrote, that we could receive the same knowledge that God had given Paul. So, though we may not have direct inspiration in the apostolic sense that Paul enjoyed, we can receive the same knowledge and understanding because what he taught was by revelation of Jesus Christ. And he shared it with the saints at Galatia and with you and with me today. Isn't it a blessing to have these teachings that come from heaven and not men? In Galatians 1, verse 13 and 14, he said, you've heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure, and I tried to destroy it, and I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. Here Paul is showing that, they've got these false teachers who were zealous of the law and trying to get Gentiles to keep the law. And he's saying, hey, I live by the law more than anybody else. And I hated Christianity and I hated the gospel and I persecuted it beyond measure. I wanted to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism above my contemporaries. So he's more or less saying, in my former conduct, I lived the kind of life these false teachers are trying to get you to live. And I changed. If they were supposed to live with the zeal of Moses' law rather than following the gospel of Christ, then why would Paul have left following Moses' law and walked according to the gospel of Christ? Why would he have changed his conduct? So when Paul lived in a way that pleased to others around him, he persecuted Christians and he excelled as a Jew. And this insinuates that the motive behind these false teachers is to just please men rather than pleasing God. And that goes back to Galatians 1 and verse 10. Paul wreaked havoc in his life before his conversion. Acts 8 and 3, Acts 9, the first two verses talks about that, and Paul brought that up often in his epistles. In Philippians 3, verse 5 and 6, he talked about how he excelled in the Jewish faith, and yet He did shameful things against the cause of Christ. The point, Paul changed from that. Why should the church go back to that? Continuing now in this discussion of his former conduct, when Paul stopped following what pleased his fellow man and started pleasing God, Paul completely changed. Let's let that a repetition of that point drive the point home. Paul changed from following Moses' law. So that's not what a Christian is called to do today. Paul was so inclined towards Moses' law that he had special credibility in what he taught regarding Christ. Nobody that was troubling the churches of Galatia had greater zeal for the law than Paul. But Paul understood that the truth of Christ and the arrival of Christ and the gospel of Christ and the sacrifice of Christ did away with those former things. And he understood that they didn't have to live by Moses' law any longer. How clear does the Lord have to be? I hope you've enjoyed today's study. I hope that it enlivens your heart to want to walk more closely with Christ. And I hope and pray that as you've begun today in the Word, that you'll live out today and every day in the mighty Word of God. Thank you, and God bless.